Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the Magi. Matthew chapter 2 and verse 1 starts off, Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem. Before we look at the passage itself, we probably ought to address the diversity, the differences in the story presented in Matthew versus the one presented in Luke. In Matthew, we read about the visit of the Magi, and then that leads to Herod's slaughter of the infants in Bethlehem and the escape of the Holy Family into Egypt. That's all given in Matthew chapter 2. Luke's account tells of the birth of Jesus. The shepherds come and they see the child. 8 days later, he is circumcised. And sometime later, usually about 40, 41 days later, you have the presentation of the child in the temple. Now, how do you take these two very different accounts and put them alongside each other? How do you synthesize this? I think the answer is to see that after the presentation of the temple, now comes the visit of the Magi. How much after? Well, maybe just a day or so, maybe a bit longer. Some people have wanted to say, well, that's 2 years later because now Jesus is 2 years old. 2 years old. We're going to see that Herod will put to death the infants, the children that are 2 years old and younger. But that doesn't mean that Jesus was 2 years old. It means that Herod is giving himself a safety margin. Now, if Herod had thought that Jesus was 2 years old, he probably would have ordered that all the children 4 years old and younger would be put to death. So, yes, I think that the visit of the Magi takes place after the presentation of the temple, but probably not a terribly long time afterwards. And so our story begins after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king. Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem. And our big question is revolving around who are these Magi and what are they doing coming to Jerusalem? The story of the Magi goes all the way back to the Persian Empire. Remember when the Old Testament comes to a close, we read in Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther that the Persian Empire had come on the scene and they were ruling that part of the world. The earliest reference we can find to the Magi in an inscription is known as the Behistun inscription. It's written by Darius the Great, and it's located on this big giant cliff face, 400 feet above the surrounding valley, near the Iranian town of Behistun. And he makes reference to this group that are a group of, I guess we could call them astrologer priests, with the emphasis on priests. Um, and this group was there in that era, and they continued to be, even after the Persian Empire had been replaced by the Parthians. The Parthians were a group that had lived up to the north of the Black Sea, and they had come in and sort of taken over what was left of the Persian Empire. Remember, the Persians had been brought to an end as a ruling force by the Greeks, by Alexander the Great, and then later on by his generals. But now the Parthians had come and taken charge, and they were ruling, and they would continue to rule for a couple of hundred years. The Parthians had invaded Israel at the beginning of Herod's reign, had driven him away. This is following the death of his father and the capture of his older brother. And Herod had only managed to escape, made his way to Rome, where the Romans had proclaimed Herod to be king of the Jews, had sent him back with some legions, and the Parthians had turned around and gone home. And ever since that time, there had been actually, they had gone into now a period of relative peace between Rome and the Parthians. That hadn't always been the case. And in the future, we're going to see war again between Rome and the Parthians, but not for about 100 years. There's going to be peace, and there was now this peace, maybe a little bit longer than that, maybe 150 years, that there was peace between Rome and the Parthians, but it was an uneasy peace. There had been war before, there would be war again, and so they were very careful not to break the peace. And these magi that show up on Herod's doorstep, one of the things that they were involved in back in Parthia was in a king-making ceremony where similar to the way, if you'll remember how the Pope took the crown and put it on the head of Charlemagne, and in a similar way, they would take the crown and put it and not nominate, but they would make it official. The Parthian king who is now coming to power, each new king would come up, and they were involved in that sort of ceremony. And so it is, our story opens where Jesus has been born in Bethlehem, and Magi from the east arrive in Jerusalem saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews?" Now, that's quite significant because Herod had not been born King of the Jews. He had been proclaimed King of the Jews by Rome. But they're asking for one who has been born to that position. And notice they continue, "For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." His star. To what does this refer? Was this a alignment of planets? Astronomers have looked and determined that around this time there were not one but several different planetary alignments and movements in the heavens that might have seemed significant to astrologers. Was this a comet? Was this, like I said, an alignment of planets? Was this some other heavenly body, maybe a nova or supernova that showed up? Or was this something else entirely? We don't really know. And so it's, people can speculate, but at the end of the day, we're just going to say we saw his star in the east, whatever that was, and have come to worship him. There's a prophecy back in the Old Testament, Numbers chapter 24 and verse 17. It's a prophecy that was made by a Mesopotamian prophet by the name of Balaam. Remember the story about how the king of Moab had hired this prophet for hire, this prophet for profit, to come down and put a curse on Israel. And instead, Balaam had given not only a blessing to Israel, but then had given this prophecy. Here it is. "I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come forth from Jacob, a scepter." And of course, the scepter is that which a king holds. So notice this correlation of a star and a king. "A scepter shall rise from Israel." And then he ties that into what's going on in his day. "He shall crush through the forehead of Moab and tear down all the sons of Sheth." And that relates to what was going on in the days in which the book of Numbers was taking place. And so there's this prophecy that had been given by a Mesopotamian prophet. I can't help but wonder if at the end of the day that prophecy had made it back to Mesopotamia and was even known to these magi. Well, Herod the king heard this, and he was troubled. And whenever Herod was troubled, all Jerusalem became troubled with him. After all, Herod, uh, by this time, had had two and would eventually have three different sons of his own put to death for conspiring against him. It was so bad that there was reputed a quip that the Emperor Caesar Augustus had made, that it was better to be Herod's hus than to be Herod's huios, that it was better to be Herod's pig than to be Herod's son, because his sons were sometimes killed by him. But he was kosher and he didn't eat pigs, and so if you were a pig belonging to Herod, you were safe. Gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he, that is Herod, inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. Herod, I don't think, had spent too much time getting to know the Hebrew scriptures. Even though he was king of the Jews, he was more interested in politics than in precepts or in faith. And so he calls them together to ask where he's heard of Messiah. Everybody had heard of the idea of Messiah, but where is the Messiah to be born? And they said to him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what has been written by the prophet." And now they quote from Micah chapter 5 and verse 2. Here's the quote: "And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah, for out of you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." The prophet had spoken, and had said, Messiah is going to come from Bethlehem. And so Herod secretly called the Magi and determined from them the exact time the star appeared. Now we're not told when that was. We're going to be told that Herod acts on that, and he's going to order the execution of all children 2 years old and under. So it's sometime within that period. And like I said before, I think he's giving himself a safety margin. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, Go and search carefully for the child, and when you have found him, report to me so that I too may come and worship him. Now, Bethlehem's only about 4 or 5 miles to the south of Jerusalem. It's a little tiny area. I almost think of it as a suburb, although today you have to go through this big border wall to get there. It's in Palestinian territory. After hearing the king, they went their way, and the star which they had seen in the east went on before them until it came and stood over the place where the child was. Now, could that be a conjunction of planets? Could that be a comet? Could that be something else? I don't know. It sounds like something specific, but I could be mistaken there. Verse 10, when they saw the star, and that sounds like they had seen it back in the east, and now they see it again, but maybe it wasn't there in all that intervening period. Again, we don't know. But when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. After coming into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell to the ground and worshipped him. Then, opening their treasures, they presented to him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Notice 3 gifts. We're not told how many magi there were. Because there's 3 gifts, people have sometimes imagined, and whole traditions have grown up around this, that there were three of the magi, 3 of these wise men. But we're not told how many there were, only that there were 3 gifts. But what I want to focus on is how they fell to the ground and worshiped him. Now, when we see that term worshiped, the Greek term proskuneo, it can mean worship, but it can also have a broader meaning. In fact, it's used regularly in the Old Testament, in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, when someone would come and bow down before someone else, not necessarily in what we think of as worship, like would worship the Lord, but in the way you would give honor to somebody by bowing down before them. The classical example, the classic example is seen in the black obelisk. Now, this is dating from back in Old Testament times. What you see here is King Jehu, one of the kings of Israel, who comes before an Assyrian monarch and bows down before him. He's not worshiping this king. He's just showing reverence and a great deal of respect. And this sounds like what the Magi come and they do for this baby Jesus. Did they do maybe more than they realized? Are they really realizing that he is God in the flesh? I don't know if they're realizing this, but at least they do bow down before them. One last thing as we come to a close, I want to take us to Bethlehem. And when you come here to the Church of the Holy Nativity, I'm actually looking across this town square with my back to the church. You go inside, and it's a wonderful place. It's the place where tradition has it that Jesus was born. I don't know if that's accurate. He was born in Bethlehem. We're not told that it was necessarily on this specific location, and you can actually go down some back steps, and they'll show you the actual location. It's interesting to see, but what really captures my attention is the entrance to the church. You see, when you look at the entrance, and you can see where it's been walled up, you can see the original entrance with the domed peak at the top, but then that's been walled up so that there's only a small, tiny entrance. And the reason they did this, according to tradition, I don't know if it's accurate, but during the days of the Crusades, the crusading knights would come and ride their horses right into the church. And so they said, we can't have that. They walled it up and left only this narrow entrance so that anyone coming into the church not only has to get down off their horse, but notice, has to bow down You have to bow down to go into the presence of the one who was born here. And I love the imagery because the imagery reminds us of the words of the Apostle Paul. And he's actually quoting from the Old Testament book of Isaiah, where he says, "For this reason also God highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name which is above every name, so that," and here's the quote, "so that the name of Jesus every knee will bow, of those who are in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and that every tongue will confess." What will they confess? That Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father.